You write about this in your new book, and I found it fascinating that when there is a narcissistic parent, there are typically roles that people tend to fall into in their family that kind of keep this dynamic propped up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So anytime you have, the more dysfunctional the family system, the more we get put into these concrete codified roles instead of having the flexibility of being able to be who we are. So we're not stuck in a role. In a narcissistic family system, there's two classical roles. One is the golden child. The golden child is the anointed heir apparent, the one who can kind of sort of do no wrong, but is sort of the hope of the family. In some families, it's a son. It's the eldest son because of whatever cultural issues are. Sometimes it's the child that most physically resembles the parent. Sometimes it's the child that does the things that the parent wants. They succeed at the sport that the parent wants or whatever it may be. Sometimes it's just a kid that's just helpful. It might even be the kid that mixes mom's martini. Whatever it is, it's that kid who is the best source of supply. That's the golden child, okay? And all other children will be compared against that child in any home that's not a single sibling home. But if it's sometimes there's cousins and others that might be compared to that child. The second role that we always see in a narcissistic family system is the scapegoat. This is the child that gets the venom of the narcissistic parent and is really that sort of more the punching bag. I'd say the golden child's the pacifier, the scapegoat is the punching bag. And this is the child who may not look the way the parent wants, behave the way the parent wants, doesn't do the things the way the parent wants them to, whatever it may be, may actually be mouthy, may call the parent out, may challenge the parent, may say, well, how come you're not treating us better? And that child will get the wrath of the narcissistic parent or parents. The scapegoat role is no joke. Anyone who's listening to this who was a scapegoat as a child will say the wounds of that role stuck with them until adulthood. They never felt safe. And it's a horrific role because the scapegoated child will often see that other siblings and other people in the family system are being treated significantly better than them. It's not like everyone's being uniformly abused, that they are getting the worst of it. And that idea that others are, that in real time you can see that you're getting it worse than others can really do a psychological number on a person. But the roles aren't just limited to those. Other roles include the rescuer, the sort of the rescuer, sort of fixer, if you will. This is the kid who's sort of always trying to make things right. They clean up after dinner. They make sure everything's running well. They kind of take away all the stressors that could set off the narcissistic parent. They're the one that almost feels anxiety while they hear the parent's car come up the driveway, like, quick, we need to clean up. We need to clean up, you guys. Come on. It's a lot of that anxiety. Rescuers, they tend to be rescuers well into adulthood. Like, we got to make it better. They tend to be appeasers. They tend to be those appeasers in the family system through adulthood. The peacekeepers are sort of the diplomats of the family. The rescuers are often doing things like, let's clean up. The peacekeeper, the diplomat, these are the people that are like, no, that's not what mom meant. Mom didn't mean that. I think, mom, you were trying to tell Billy that you kind of liked it, right? And they're constantly trying to get in there like some really hapless UN diplomat trying to make peace between countries who don't want it. And the peacekeeper diplomat child is always on edge, like watching so they never get to relax. They're always paying attention. Then there's the invisible child. Have a big enough narcissistic family system, this is the kid that literally gets forgotten. They may be very independent, they may be very quiet, but they're very forgotten. And oftentimes their interests aren't cultivated. Sometimes they're not even picked up from school. Like, we're talking that invisible. And I'm
laughing because that's my husband.
And the final role is something we either call the truth teller or the truth seer. It depends on how much they're telling. The truth seer, truth teller role can overlap with the scapegoat, but this is a very interesting role. This is the kid who gets it and sees it, even as young as 5 or 6. They will see a pattern, and when they're little and they don't know to inhibit, they'll say, how come you said that? How come you did that mean thing to grandma? And that narcissistic person, it's like the Eye of Sauron and Lord of the Rings, like, they'll be like, what? And that kid can go to scapegoat like that. Some truth seer kids don't say a word. They just watch all of this, and they're very aware, acutely aware. This is almost like a gifted feel to them in the sense of they're very aware of who the players are. It's so fascinating, though, because one thing we know about narcissistic people is they're very socially perceptive. for how unempathic they are, for how selfish they are. They can read a room really well in the sense of how it affects them. So if they sense someone has their number, they're onto them. So that truth seer kid, in a way, is kind of in a position of risk, because the narcissistic parent, can almost feel that child's contempt. Like the child is almost saying like, this isn't cool. Mm-hmm. And the kid may not even be saying it. Mm-hmm. It's a very subtle dynamic, but I've worked with a lot of survivors who will say, I knew this was a mess, and somehow my parent knew I knew. And that really put me in their crosshairs.
Is it normal when somebody starts to wake up and see and accept the situation for what it is? Is anger part of this too?
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, anger is great. Anger is my favorite emotion.
Well, because
let me tell you why.
Please, because okay? I also think a lot about the fact that if there is a parent that's narcissistic and your parents are still together, there is also a parent that didn't protect you from that person.
That's right. Right. So that's where we start getting into the weeds. So why is anger so great for survivors? Because it's a mobilizing emotion. It's an activating emotion, right? Unlike sadness or anxiety that can create a heaviness or even an apathy, anger is a let's go emotion, right? But anger scares us. We think of anger as being a narcissistic emotion, but in fact, the narcissistic people are rageful, not angry. Anger is great. And when something is unjust, anger is what we should feel. Like, this is not okay, right? Anger is a stage of grief. So anger and grief very much go together. So let's assume that you've got a narcissistic parent and a non-narcissistic parent, right? Because some people have two narcissistic parents. And all I can say is that I promise there's a special corner of heaven for them. But more often than not, it's a narcissistic parent and a non-narcissistic parent. And this gets complicated because what many people will say is, I'm very aware of the suffering that my non-narcissistic parent did endure at times. They were humiliated, they were embarrassed, they were criticized. The real agony is the sense of abandonment that the child feels by that non-narcissistic parent, thinking like, you were the parent. It was your job to keep us safe. And for an adult in that situation, it becomes a very complex set of emotions. Whatever that case may be, sometimes people will say, I get why they didn't fight back, and I get that they were going through their own thing. And then there's often a sense of guilt at being angry at the non-narcissistic parent for not fighting harder for them, and then in a sense of anger for feeling abandoned by that person. So when you combine anger and guilt and empathy into a blender, it is one of the most difficult to swallow smoothies you are ever going to taste in your life.
What do you do? I may be seeking personal advice here. When the narcissistic parent has died, and now they are the golden person, and the way in which the narrative about that person is being told publicly is just so glowing and so wonderful. Mm-hmm. And you see the surviving parent waxing on and on and on about the narcissistic one, and you're sitting there going, that's not true.
Right. So this is an interesting kind of a conundrum, right? In some ways, when the narcissistic person is gone, systems are often now willing to sort of hold them up because I think everyone's collectively relieved. So they get to kind of maintain this false narrative of, now I can talk about him glowingly and I get to look good, which makes you wonder how much of that narcissism infected the entire system, because you get to talk about the dead person like they're cool, but because they're dead and they're not going to be able to keep bothering you. And you get to seem like a great grieving person, and you're sort of filling the grief role, as it were, of being the grieving widow or widower or whatever it may be. Now, different people will approach this differently. Some people will say, well, now that that person's gone, I'm going to speak my truth and I don't care. Others will feel as though maybe this isn't the time because this person is gone. It's going to be different in every system. But that complicated series of reactions after the death of a narcissistic person who had emotionally or otherwise harmed you, it's not an easy one. And a lot of people say, well, now they're gone, this is going to be easy. I'm like, no, there's going to be some maybe pragmatic relief that you no longer need to deal with them and work around them. But now the rest of the system is not going to have the same kind of clean series of reactions you do. And so it gets messy. And I think that It's giving yourself space to have the complex grief that a narcissistic loss brings, to be in therapy. When people will say, do I confront the family? It's back to the tiger's cage. Okay? What may happen is anytime you confront anyone in a narcissistic family system, and just because a narcissist is dead doesn't mean this is still not a narcissistic family system. The roles are still held. All the toxic patterns are in place. They don't just disappear with the narcissistic person.
Well, that's a huge point. That you think because now the relationship is over or the person is dead,
gone.
that all of the
Heck no.
wreckage, no, now you're just dealing with
The
it.
homage to the narcissist in many ways is that the family system stays exactly the same.
Oh, that sucks.
It really sucks.
Well, because I'm also thinking about the example of that I'm sure so many of you listening can relate to, which is you have children with a narcissist.
Yeah.
The relationship ends. And you not only have to deal with that sort of sense of this isn't fair. This person has moved on. Everybody's rallied around them. All is forgiven. I'm sitting here holding the bag. Whether it's the hope or I won't allow myself to grieve, but then your kids have their own relationship with this person.
That's right.
What are strategies that you can use when you are in a system that is still active? Whether it's because you share children with somebody or because you're part of a family system where there's been narcissistic abuse, how do you protect yourself?
Part of it is the radical acceptance that the system is still the system, right? That the narcissistic person in a way has sort of, if you will, infected the system in a way, and that those roles keep us comfortable in a way. They keep us safe. That's why dysfunctional systems call for roles, because they create a sense of either safety or definition. I don't know that the scapegoat role keeps someone safe, but it's a very clear role, right? So it's the radical acceptance that those things are going to persist. Then there has to be, again, an intentional self-exploration of how do I want the people who remain in the system to remain in my life? If you are co-parenting and you have adult children with a narcissistic person with whom you're no longer in a relationship, don't ever gaslight your kids, but also don't proselytize them either.
What does that even mean?
It's not your job to convince your kids that their other parent is narcissistic. It's actually not okay. If they come to that awareness themselves, they can share it. You don't want to jump on it like, yeah, isn't he the worst? But like, that's a lot to take in. Do you want to talk about it? This may not feel the safest place. Like, I hope you do get to explore it. How can I be a support to you as you figure this out? Because it's not easy.
Though, I would imagine in that scenario that if you're somebody who feels like this isn't just, and your adult kids come around and they finally come to you and say, Mom, Dad's a narcissist. You're right. Your first reaction is going to be, finally. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to say something that's not, you will, because that's the justice you're looking for.
Correct. It is a justice you're looking for, but you want to tread lightly because kids feel loyal to their parents, even their narcissistic parents. And they're testing the waters. Don't think they're coming in here to say you're comrades in arms. They're testing the waters. And if you're too enthusiastic, you may be viewed as a problem. But like, if they say, Mom, I'm so sorry. We never made this easier for you. It is so clear he is narcissistic. We went on this ski trip with him and his new girlfriend. Oh my God. And then again, at the highest level of functioning, you'd say, do you want to talk about it? Do you not? I understand if you don't feel comfortable about it, but it's a lot. I hear you. I get it. By saying I get it, that's really code for yeah. And that I'm here. But you can have that justice within yourself, Mel. It doesn't have to be a justice parade.
Well, I just feel like this is something that's incredibly relatable.
Very relatable.
In the earlier episode, even though this is not like validated by a scientific study, you basically feel, after decades of doing this, that 1 out of every 5 or so people display this narcissistic style of personality. So if I think about the fact that 50% of relationships or more end in divorce, and I think about the number of people listening that are recognizing that they may have been married to somebody like this, once you deal with your own radical acceptance and you give up hope that anything's going to change and you accept the situation for what it is and you stop looking for justice and you are in your own healing and you're using the tools in your new book, I would imagine that any parent listening would love to know the best way that they could accelerate the healing of their children from this. How do you show up both for yourself and for the kids that are being impacted by that parent?
So here's one thing to always remember. Nobody walks away from a narcissistic parent unscathed. It's not possible. No matter what, if a person has had a narcissistic parent, it will negatively affect you. Now, in the extreme, obviously, it'd be things like complex trauma. Some people with narcissistic parent become narcissistic themselves. We might see things like addiction in response to that. The vast majority of people who had narcissistic parents develop significant anxiety, self-doubt, social anxiety, all the stuff that goes with that. Am I doing enough? Am I enough? That sort of thing, right? But we'll put that in the bucket of anxiety. So if you are co-parenting in that situation, your kids will be anxious. That's a fact. Okay, that's number one. So let's start there. Number two is don't try to fix it. I think that the big mistake that we make with our kids is we try to solve problems, right? We are not their life coaches. We are not their efficiency coaches. We are their parents. And sometimes they're mad at us. They're mad at us for having found this person and having kids with them. And they're never going to be able to put it in that many words. So there are times we will be these children's punching bags, right? We have different tolerances for that. Some behavior is acceptable, some is not. But it's to be that place where you kids, if they start talking about something, it's not how can we fix it? It's how are you feeling? And then you can say, how can I help? And it might be just to listen. Every kid's different in these situations. And Mel, in the most tragic telling of this story, sometimes your kids ally with the narcissistic parent. I know many people in the situation where they've lost at least one adult child. Narcissistic parents love bomb their kids when they're adults. And when they come into young adulthood, now the narcissistic person has made their own supply. It's quite remarkable for them. And the one thing a narcissistic parent will often do if they've got it is use money. I'll pay your rent. I'll get your apartment. I'll get you a car. And depending on the kid, some kids don't fall for it, but some do. And they may feel a loyalty to that parent. They may feel sorry for that parent, but they also may be calculating themselves. And if the narcissistic co-parent is somebody who is willing to say terrible things about the other parent, then you might have lost this battle. Because I think that's a very unique situation when because you might have multiple kids and some of your kids still have a relationship with you and some of them have gone over to the narcissistic parent, but people who only have one or two kids and they've all allied with that other parent, that is something that some people say they may not ever be able to fully grieve.
You said that the grieving part of this is the hardest part. So what are the tools that you can use to help yourself grieve when you are recovering from a narcissistic relationship?
Number one, recognize it as a loss. And in fact, the person going through this kind of losses, I think it's on the level of more complicated even than the loss of a death. So it's the giving yourself, grief takes time. When we have a grief-laden loss, like a death, we mourn. We think of the Tibetan 49 days. We think of sitting Shiva for loss for people who observe the Jewish faith. We think about the various ways it shows up in some cultures. In South Asian culture, we can't touch each other in a certain period of time after there's been a loss in the family. You don't go to a temple. You don't share food together. So it's always going to be different, right? But those rituals ground us in loss. There are times when we're allowed to press the stop button on the clock and attend to ourselves. We don't build that time in when it's this kind of grief. So a person has to take that for themselves and build in that kind of time.
There is so much content out there about how to spot a narcissist. What do you do once you realize you either have a parent who's one or you're in a relationship with somebody?
People don't like the suggestion I'm about to make, and I'm aware they don't like it, and I don't care. I'm going to make it, which is what I call